outside.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're viewing this panel from, maybe around the world. Thanks so much for joining us here for this exciting panel tonight. We're calling Identifying Van Gogh Myths. I'm Jill Shaw. I'm the head of the James Pearson Duffy Department of Modern and Contemporary Art here at the DIA. I'm also the Rebecca A. Boylan and Thomas W. Sidlik Curator of European Art from 1850 to 1970. Could I have the next slide, please? And one more. Thank you. This panel is part of our programming for our Van Gogh in America exhibition, which will be closing in just 10 days on January 22nd. If you haven't seen it yet, please come. I know I'm biased as the curator of the exhibition, but it really is a special show, and it's not often, unless you're at the Van Gogh Museum, that you can see 74 works by him under one roof. Van Gogh in America is part of the Bonnie Ann Larson Modern European Artist Series here at the DIA. And we're incredibly grateful for the many sponsors listed here on this slide. Without their generous support, this exhibition would not have been possible. So thank you. I'm also grateful to my colleagues here at the DIA, and especially with this program, I want to thank Beverly Berry, Larry Baranski, our wonderful public programming team, and our audiovisual team, who have made it possible for this to be seamlessly, we hope and think, we trust, seamlessly live streamed tonight. And they also did a wonderful job this morning live streaming our scholarly panels earlier. So I'm also beyond thankful for my colleague Dorota Chudzicka, who was a contributor to our Van Gogh in America exhibition catalog and will be co-moderating this panel with me tonight. Dr. Chudzicka is a specialist in 19th and early 20th century European art, and she joined the Detroit Institute of Arts in 2019 as assistant curator of modern European art. At the DIA, she manages research on the museum's collection of modern European art and develops and contributes to modern European exhibitions and gallery installations, most recently Van Gogh's Artistic Roots, the Hague School, and French Realism. Prior to joining the DIA, she held research and curatorial positions at the Art Institute of Chicago, the National Museum of Asian Art, Freer Sackler Galleries, Smithsonian Institution, and the Qatar Museums. And I'm also especially excited tonight to present our distinguished panelists. Nienke Bakker, in the middle, is the Van Gogh Museum's senior curator of paintings. She was part of the editorial team behind the online version of Van Gogh's complete correspondence and the 6-volume publication, Vincent van Gogh, The Letters, from 2009. She's contributed to many exhibitions and publications on Vincent van Gogh and late 19th century art, including Van Gogh at Work from 2013, Felix Vallotton in 2014, On the Verge of Insanity, Van Gogh and His Illness from 2016, Van Gogh in Japan, 2018, and Van Gogh in the Olive Groves just last year, 2021. Teio Meedendorp is a senior researcher. He's on the far end by Dorota, senior researcher at the Van Gogh Museum. He's interested in authenticity issues and everything connected to the places where Van Gogh lived and worked. He published the catalog of Van Gogh's drawings in the collection of the Kroller-Müller Museum, Otterlo, and has contributed to various publications on Van Gogh, including Van Gogh's studio practice from 2013, the Vincent van Gogh Atlas, 2015, and Van Gogh and the Olive Groves from last year. Louis van Tilbourgh is a senior researcher at the Van Gogh Museum as well, and he's also professor of art history, specializing in Van Gogh at the University of Amsterdam. He's published widely on Van Gogh and was jointly responsible for several exhibitions on the artist, including Van Gogh and Millet from 1988 and 1998. The major survey on Van Gogh's paintings at the Van Gogh Museum in 1990, On the Verge of Insanity, Van Gogh and His Illness, 2016, Van Gogh in Japan, 2018, and Van Gogh and the Olive Groves from last year. So we're thrilled that Nienke, Teio, and Louis have come from Amsterdam to help all of us continue to learn more about Van Gogh, an artist who has been embraced by so many and about whom many myths have been generated. We will have time for Q&A, not only from those of you who are here live in the room, but also those who are watching from the comforts of their home or elsewhere. So without further ado, I will turn it over to my colleague Dorota, and we will start our panel.
Thank you, Jill, Nienke, Teio, and Louis. We are delighted to have you here tonight. I think we have an exciting evening ahead of us. So let's start. There is a commonly held belief that Van Gogh's work met with almost uniformly indifferent or hostile reaction. The Van Gogh in America exhibition chronicles how gradually Van Gogh's work began to be appreciated in the United States. In Europe, however, the situation was different. Would you share with us how well Van Gogh was known during his lifetime and how his renown spread in Europe after his death?
Wow. Would you like to start?
You start. You start.
So,
You add something to
hi. Well, thanks. Is this on? Yeah. Are you, okay. So first of all, thank you so much for inviting us, for having us here, for allowing us to see this fantastic exhibition. I mean, for us, even though we've seen a lot of his works, it's just so great to see so many together. It's really, I think this is maybe the last time that so many works by Vincent have been brought together. It's really an achievement, and I'm amazed. I wanted to start with that. I mean, it's really an achievement. So, but to come back to your question, it's not true that Van Gogh enjoyed no success at all during his lifetime. Things were starting to, or his reputation was starting to pick up in the last years of his life. He only was an artist for 10 years, so quite a short period. And in the last 2 years, he actually participated in exhibitions in Paris of the avant-garde.
and made his best work too.
Well, of course, in the last, well, you've seen many examples of it in the show. His best works date from the last 2 years of his life. And so he did, actually things were starting to happen when he died. And of course, we will always have the unanswerable question, what would have happened if he hadn't died at that moment? I mean, I'm absolutely sure that he would received more success, that he would live to hopefully enjoy it. We won't be so sure about that, because he was also quite, he found it difficult to, that there was actually critics starting to write about him. So yeah, maybe you want to add something about how first it happened first in France, then in Germany, his work picked up.
Maybe we should generalize a little bit. I mean, we talk about myth all the time. And what is actually a myth? I mean, a myth is something which is not real. You tend to think is wrong. But a myth is also something that
it's based on
reality to a certain extent as well, and so true as well. So if you think of the myths of the Greek gods, maybe they do not exist, but nevertheless there's always a human story behind it from which we human beings learn something. And in the case of Van Gogh as a doomed artist, because that's the myth that we're talking here about, somebody who wasn't respected by his contemporaries. Well, it's true and it isn't. And that has indeed something to do with the 10 years that Nienke talked about. Because when he started, he had 2 left hands. I mean, he couldn't paint, he couldn't draw, not really. So it took, and it takes you some time to learn something, as we all know, because we've all been to school, I predict. That you've all been to school and you had to learn something, and that takes time. And in Europe, we always see you as Americans as good entrepreneurs and good businessmen. Now, you must all know that it takes time, if you've got a good product, to sell it. And that's the same in Van Gogh terms. He had to develop, well, you could say, an audience for his work and also develop his craft. And that's what happened in 10 years. And that makes it miraculous in the sense that it's very short in principle. It's only the last 2 years of his life that he made the best work. That's the work that we still admire. And so, although his reputation was a small one, it was rather quick, you tend to think. And if you tend to if you reckon that afterwards, and now we're talking about the difference between having a small circle of admirers to having exhibitions. Sorry. Oh, that's much better. Did you understand anything of what I said? No? Shall I do it again? Yeah, yes? Really have to? Okay. Then I'll start all over. I'm so sorry. I wanted to tell you that, so we're talking about Van Gogh has become the personalization of the doomed artist, somebody who was not understood by his fellow man, by the contemporary, the art market, etc. That's the myth. And that's not true, in the sense that you have to reckon that he only painted for 10 years and that the best work that he made was the last 2 years. Well, I have to repeat the joke again. You are Americans, we are European, we come from Europe, so we tend to think that you know all about entrepreneurship and about being a businessman. Well, that's important to realize, because you must know that if you have a project in your hands, you know that you have to develop it, you know that you have to sell it, and you know that it takes time. And that's the same with Van Gogh. He developed something which was revolutionary within 5-6 years, had different, you could say, starts, and had to face different styles. And at the end, he knew for himself that he had reached something that was important. And that's important to realize, I think. He knew that it was something worthwhile, what he did. But that's the end of his career. So then, I mean, it was within 10 years that he developed that. And then he had to sell it. So went to a few exhibitions, and then he died. And then rather quickly, he became famous. And he became rather quickly, in the sense that there's a nice book about this, The Conditions of Success, historically and nowadays. And the man who wrote it, who was the director of the Tate Gallery, says that it takes you at least 15 years from the moment that you get a small recognition until public acclaim, in the sense that you come to museums. And for Gogh already, I think 12 years after he died, his work was already in museums, and that's rather quickly. So if you say that he was a doomed artist, you have to realize that he died too soon. So that's important to realize. It's a myth in the sense that his reputation was a quick one, but it's true that he himself felt that he was a doomed artist.
And it's usually that the first praise you get usually from people quite close to you. And especially in modern art circles, it's the contemporary artists, the other artists you're friends with, the circle that sees something in you, something that they perhaps are striving after as well. And so that's the first circle of acclaim, you might say. So it's from colleagues and exhibiting together. And as Van Gogh was a temperamental guy, you might say. So what he did in Paris was stage his own exhibition, for instance, together with Toulouse-Lautrec and Wim Bernard, and to get his name and to get his works across. So he did all the efforts, and so he did. It was not that he was just sitting back and waiting for acclaim. No, he was busy in that sense as well. And indeed, he died very suddenly, and after 10 years of work. And as Louis said, indeed, so when he started out, he had indeed 2 left hands. He was not a natural talent as Picasso was at Toulouse-Lautrec. So he only started as an artist when he was 27. And it's very late to begin. But you must always remember that even Picasso had his first one-man show at 40, but Van Gogh never reached 40.
Yeah.
So he was not entirely isolated from the art scene.
Not at all. No.
But was he isolated from the art market of his time? There is this another popular image that the artist was rejected by gallerists and dealers, and that he sold only one work or didn't sell any single works during his lifetime.
That's
Is
the
it
other myth.
true
That's-
or is it a myth? It's a myth.
Well, it
the other
depends
myth.
on how you look
Yeah,
at
look,
it, right?
it depends on how you look at it. But it's the thing that he sold only one painting in his life. That's not exactly true. What is true is that the painting, I think you have it here, the Red Vineyard, which was sold in 1890 at the exhibition of Levin in Brussels, and was bought by Anna Boch, a female painter. She was the sister of Edward Boch, and it was a friend of Van Gogh. So it is within the same artistic circles, you might say, that the painting was bought, for instance. And this painting was bought for a substantial sum. So it was bought for 400 francs, which was at the time, I believe, like $30, $40, I believe, which was a reasonable price for an impressionist, a coming artist, you might say, quite a reasonable price.
Gauguin received those.
And that's what Gauguin
amounts,
said,
yeah.
got as well, and he was also just beginning. I mean, they were all just beginning at that time.
And he believed that the sunflowers were worth 500 francs.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So to put it into
Kind of perspective.
a little bit.
But it's
But he sold more. So in Paris, we have some evidence that he sold, there was a self-portrait sold of his to England. We don't know where it is. But even when he only started out as an artist in The Hague in 1882, he got a commission from his uncle, who was an art dealer. Of course, also from his uncle to help him out a little bit. So he gave him commission to make drawings of city scenes of The Hague, and which he did. And he made 12 drawings. One of them is in the exhibition. Beautiful drawings. But his uncle didn't like them. Because what his uncle thought, when I give someone a commission to make city scenes of The Hague, you want the famous places of The Hague. But Vincent was more interested in the suburbs. So he got views of meadows, simple streets and urban folk and things like that. And that was not appreciated. His uncle gave him a second commission for larger drawings, but he did exactly the same. And then the contact with the uncle was over. So, but it was a commission. I mean, so he made a little bit money and he was looking forward to be more successful, but it took some time.
But
So
I think
on-
you could say that that this painting was his first official sale,
First official sale.
through the art, well, not through the art market, but through an exhibition, and official recognition in a sense. But of course, it wasn't the only painting that he sold in his lifetime.
And he exchanged a lot, of
Yeah.
course. But what artists do is that you exchange. So you build your own collection. You get known by exchanging your works with other works. So
It's part of the
that's
tradition
part of
the
tradition,
exchange
exactly. Yeah,
between
so, yeah,
artists
yeah.
as a sign of allegiance and
It is
friendship.
true in that sense that he did not have an art dealer, as you perhaps would go to. So who was somebody who would sell the work for you, and it's always been asked.
Teio was
why-
trying,
Yeah,
but-
Teio was trying, but there was a difficulty, of course, because Vincent had worked with the Goupil firm, so the firm where Theo worked for as well, but he was fired. And so there was not a very good connection between the bosses of Goupil and Vincent. So Theo, also working for Goupil, could do something on his own with the modern art, and he was staging Gauguin, Degas, Monet, Pissarro in his gallery. So the modern art, he was allowed to do that. But to push his brother forward, who was even more modern than some of the others were, that would have been too much for the bosses probably as well.
Right.
So it would be seen as a potential. The other way around, it's also interesting for other artists, knowing Vincent, to know him because his brother was an art dealer. So that's also part of the whole thing.
Right, right. And on that note, was he struggling with poverty? Was he poor, as the popular
That's
idea?
No, not at all.
Makes us believe.
That's really that's really a myth. That's not true because his brother was sending him money basically 3 times a month, making different installments, because otherwise Vincent would spend it right away. He was sending, I think, around 150 francs a month when he was living in the south of France. And his brother was also sending him painting materials. So in that period, he didn't need to buy them from the allowance that he was getting. And just to compare, it's a well-known comparison, but the postman, of whom you have this very nice portrait here, he got, I believe, 135 francs per month, and he had 3 children and a whole family to take care of. So he was not poor. He just was not saving his money,
I spent
spending it all on paint
Yeah,
and
spent all on paint.
drink and models and stuff like that.
But on the other hand, he lived in cheap hotels, went to cheap restaurants, and felt, of course, that he was an outsider. So if you would compare it what his brother had, he was poor. If you would compare it with somebody who like Roulin had a lesser job, who was lower class, then he was a little bit richer.
But he never cooked. And he always had a maid cleaning his studio.
Yeah.
Also in the south of France.
Something that
So
people forget. Yeah.
And he always ate out, cheap, but always ate out. Couldn't cook. That's what Gauguin said as he came there. He said, he can't cook.
And paint isn't cheap.
And of course, they made it. They struck a deal because Fear was sending all this money, so supporting his brother in that sense. But of course, Vincent realized very much that he had to be independent in the end, and it's weighed on him in several moments, even to the point that, and sometimes the contact between the two brothers were not that good, and he felt it even more that he had to be independent. So he had this very lucrative idea of is that, well, you're sending money, you're supporting me, you're sending them money, but instead of it, all the work I make is yours. So it's like you're paying me for working. So as if he was his boss, I'd say. Of course, he had a great say in what he was giving, but that's the deal they struck.
Right. And that's also why we have all these beautiful letters, because he was keeping Teio informed of what he was doing and also had to acknowledge the receipt of the money. So there's a constant stream of letters, which we wouldn't have if there hadn't been this deal between them.
But for certain, he was living on the verge of society. I mean, it's important to realize that he himself felt that he was an outsider.
Part of the artistic
and
bohemian kind of.
And that's a strange situation to be in, I tend to think, because you believe that you do something which is culturally important, you think that you do something for humanity, and at the same time you know that your neighbor won't recognize you as somebody who's very important, and even you tend to think that art dealers are not paying attention to you. So it's a difficult situation to live in. Mm-hmm. So you have big ideas in your head, but the actual situation is a different one.
Mm-hmm.
In 1921, German art critic and writer Julius Meyer-Graefe published a biography of Van Gogh in which he was portrayed as a tragic hero. Could you elaborate on Meyer-Graefe's role in building a myth of Van Gogh as a martyr and misunderstood genius?
I think this ties in with what you were saying about the doomed artist.
It's not the first one. I mean, we have to go back a little bit to what it is to be a misunderstood artist and where it comes from. And it comes from the fact that artists from the beginning of the 19th century didn't want to be employed anymore by somebody who wishes to say that what he wanted to make. So you have to be independent. And that means to a certain extent that you, move to the virtual society because there are no people who's going to pay for you unless you make something that they think that is worthwhile to spend their money on. From that time onwards, you've got bohemians, people who live outside, who drink too much, do stuff that the other part of society do not really understand. Or, I'm just sketching here a cliche, but that's roughly how it was. And so this myth goes on, and Van Gogh seems to be the personalization of this cliche. And it has something to do with the fact not only that he himself believed that he was poor and that he was living on the verge of society, but also he became what we say mad. He got an illness and in the end decided to end his own life. These are all tragic kind of things, and they belong to the myth to a certain extent. Because, this is part of the bohemian side. There are many persons who artists who decided to end their life in that way, but we do not know them anymore because they're simply minor artists. And in the case of Van Gogh, he became a great artist. So that's part of the myth. This started very earlier, even before Meyer-Graefe, the Dutch critic wrote that. There was a French critic, Aurier, who wrote more or less the same thing. And so this is blown out of proportion, as I just explained, but nevertheless has some truth in it.
Yeah, and I think Van Gogh was very aware of this image of the suffering artist. I mean, he was also reading artist letters, artist biographies. It was a very romantic idea that was already present in his time. And yeah, he's also commenting on that, saying we artists and we are outside of society and we're struggling for our art and giving our whole life for it and all that. Yeah, and I think that Aurier picked up on that, and he then sort of put Van Gogh forward as the prototype of the well, first of all, he's put him forward as a symbolist artist, but also as a suffering genius who wasn't understood, who was destined not to be understood, and yeah, then everyone took on that idea, culminating in Lust for Life, I think.
Yeah, of course, all the way
the
to Lust
famous
for Life,
movie.
Living Stone in the
Yeah.
movie. That's good. And Aurier wrote it at a time, of course, when Van Gogh was in the asylum. And so the link between genius and madness and things is more easily made, but it's also a bit more difficult than like that. But and Meyer Graefe took up on it, you might say, and already in 1904, when he first wrote about this in Entwicklungsgeschichte der moderne Kunst, and then further in the 1920s, and it was picked up also indeed by Irving Stone in his novel.
But if you go back to Van Gogh himself, he was afraid that he would become like that. And you don't realize that because it was a myth that for them was more or less part of reality. There was a chance that he might become mad or ill or whatever. That's before he cut off his ear. That's before he got the psychosis. He was afraid that he would become like that.
And since we're starting to talk about his illness, there is this common idea that Van Gogh's artistic practice stemmed from his episodes of mental crisis. How does this idea hold against what is known about Van Gogh's working methods?
Well, I think first of all, we have to say that most of the time when he was ill, he couldn't work. He had these periods of which could last sometimes days, sometimes weeks, in which he was totally confused and couldn't do anything, so couldn't work either. So most of the works were not done during such periods, and actually during the periods that he was feeling, well, okay or lucid or whatever you want to call it. I think that's first of all. And then also that Van Gogh, this whole idea that Van Gogh was a very spontaneously working artist who was just throwing the paint on the canvas in some kind of, artistic frenzy is not true at all. He was, in fact, working very methodically, and he could only work so fast at some point in the last couple of years because he had been practicing and constantly improving his skills. So it was actually very much based on study and training, and although he was mainly self-trained, I mean, it was not at all some kind of isolated genius thing. He was always looking at other people's art and always reading about art and drawing copies and stuff like that. So I think that's important to start with, and maybe you want to.
And it's also good to add that to think that if you paint quickly, it means actually that you have to think more, because you have to realize that what you do, you have to put it on at once. So you really have to know what you're doing. So it's more or less the opposite of what people tend to think. If you are painting slowly, you can think less because you can change it. But if you paint directly and spontaneously, you have to think more. And I think it's one of the greatest gifts of Van Gogh that he was quite intellectually gifted. So he knew what he was doing and planned things before he started to do it. And of course, in the process, you can change certain things and you come to ideas as well because you get in kind of flow. But nevertheless, thinking is very important if you paint directly like he did and spontaneously on a canvas.
And the painting on the back you see is now on its entrance to a quarry. And he made this painting very, very shortly before he had one of the most serious crises that he had. When he came out of this crisis, he elaborated in the letter to Theo that it came very suddenly, all of a sudden, the crisis. And he said, when I was just making this picture, everything was calm in a certain sense. And there is no really a sign that would tell that this was painted by someone who was at the verge, you might say, almost a moment of getting a severe crisis where he got completely stupefied. And but I've written the entry for a new catalogue for the collection catalogue of Van Gogh Museum from this period, and it's a wonderful, beautiful insight into a stone quarry from a slight height. But you can tell from the trees that you see on the left and the right, they are more from the imagination, and they have more this encirclement and create movement, you might say, in the whole vision. So it was perhaps is that maybe an indication that he felt something coming on, because they may be a little too more loose than others, but it's very difficult to really pinpoint it down to things like that, because it's very in cope with the whole painting itself, and there's not. And then when he got this crisis, so he wouldn't work for almost more than a month. And the weird thing is sometimes that after a crisis, he makes sometimes the most calmest works immediately after, which are very, very focused. That there is a new, and he was always also surprised that when the first time when he came out of this crisis, just after cutting his ear and being hospitalized, is that he thought, well, you can have a cold and it goes away. Well, you can get mad for a moment and it goes away as well. He didn't realize that there was something going on, because he could simply continue painting without having any influence on his work. So indeed, so it's not so his work is not, you might say, a style diagnosis of his mental position. It's slightly different, but Louis can.
Yeah, maybe because I mean, he's being described as a mad artist, but what does it actually mean? I mean, we know that he cut off his ear. We had an interesting exhibition and a project some years ago to define what kind of illness he could have had, because from the beginning, I don't know how many theories there are, 37 or something like that.
There's loads of them. Yeah,
I've forgotten, to be quite honest.
Different diagnoses.
Yeah, we always say that Van Gogh had as many diseases as the doctors that write about him are specialized in, and that's
and every
true
time
to
there's a new
certain extent.
disease, he's had it. So
and that it's not only to be negative about the psychiatrist, but what you see in general, that the kind of illnesses that he should have are also defined by time, because there are, of course, the knowledge about the diseases become broader, and then the names of the diseases also changes. And what we have learned from that project, I tend to think, is that the name is not that important. It's difficult simply to make a diagnosis in general, I would tend to think, although the psychiatrists that we worked with still wanted to have names. But we've dropped the idea because we think it doesn't help to understand what's going on. And what is going on is that you want to know the length of a mental crisis, why he had certain mental crisis, because that's what he had. There was in the beginning, after one of the things that we learned of the psychiatrists is that there was probably a difference between a psychosis and a delirium at the beginning. So he had a delirium, cut off his ear. No, cutting off his ear. He cut off his ear, had a delirium, and that probably a psychosis. And if you've had one psychosis, you get most of the time a next one. And we know nowadays that if you have those kind of psychosis, you have to be very quick and do something about it. But Van Gogh lived in the 19th century, and he went to an asylum, and so there was no really a treatment for it. So he had several psychoses, although some of them might not have been psychosis, but at least he had attacks in which he didn't know what he was doing.
And afterwards he was feeling very depressed. And,
yeah. And that's what happens. So you get depressed, and that's the stage you're in between the crisis that you have. Mm-hmm. And the depressions, in the end, you tend to think ended up to the fact that he decided to end his life. So that's the tragic story behind it. But he painted in between the attacks. And we've got another one, because this is...
Another thing to add, perhaps, is that when we did on the Verge of Insanity publication and also the exhibition, is the influence of alcohol in this case, because he was more a drunk than we realized. in the sense that, well, he himself writes it in his letters. So the point that when he from Paris, when he left it for the south of France, that he more escaped the city, you might say, because if he had stayed longer, he would have become a drunk with all this bad red wine and everything. And when somebody writes that you almost become a drunk, you usually already are a bit of a drunk. And the big trouble was is that Vincent especially indulged in the spirits, so the high alcohol spirits like brandy, but also especially absinthe, so which was the favorite drinks of the Bohemian circles. And of course that continued in Arles. And that's why we talk about the delirium, because then when he cut off his ear and he got very anxiety, he came into the hospital, but then he was abstinated, of course, from alcohol. He couldn't get any alcohol. And that's when he really got his first serious crisis.
So it's at least 3 years of heavy drinking. We tend to think that plays a role too. And also the stress of living in the South as a foreigner. Not having much contact with the people around you, not having artists around you, and then Gauguin came, but that was extra stress too, because he wanted to prove to Gauguin that he was really just as good as this master. So there was a lot of stress going on in combination with alcohol, and we all know that's not good for you.
A lot of coffee and alcohol, and tobacco. So he was continuously smoking. He once called it already when he was only in his 20s. His only vice was smoking, because he couldn't stop smoking a pipe.
Yeah. And we do not want to explain away the fact that he might be a curious person in, how would you explain that? In the basis, because he was from 20 onwards, well, maybe not depressed, but certainly melancholic. His parents at a certain time thought he was so weird that they thought that he might have to go to an asylum, which he refused. And it's difficult to make out what actually was going on. But certainly he was different than most of others. And that was for him a problem, and also for his environment. And so you have to keep that in mind.
But I think it's important to stress that his art was not the outcome of his mental condition. I mean, obviously, but I think it's important to stress, and that, well, for a long time, his art was his only. He really saw it as it would help him get better, and so whenever he could, after a crisis, he would take up his work again, and it was basically at some point the only thing for which he lived, and especially in the asylum, of course, it was what cut him up again. So it was like his treatment in a way, but of course,
Yeah, and also I tend to think meant as a sign that he was worthy, because the whole family, of course, considered him failed, and he wanted to prove that he was somebody, that he was worth looking after, or worth looking at, and his art as well. So that plays a role too.
Could we see Wheat Filled with Crows, please? There we go. So we've talked a little bit about Lust for Life, or we've invoked it. But in the 1956 film, there was a very dramatic scene portraying Van Gogh working on this painting, Wheat Filled with Crows, just before he took his own life. The work has long been considered Van Gogh's last painting, and often interpreted in a symbolic way as an illustration of Van Gogh's declining mental health and inner torment. Was Wheat Filled with Crows Van Gogh's last work?
Nope.
you felt that coming, right?
Yes. No, it's not. Well, the thing is that it goes back even to 1890 already. 1891, the first critic, you're on the mess.
It starts in 1890 with, it's
the,
called The Desolation of Fields Immediately. And
exactly.
It's this picture, and the other one, maybe we can have that too, on Cardiff with the crows.
Oh, no, the one before. I think it was one before, previous one. Yeah. The one before, yeah.
So
this one.
These two are named in the beginning immediately and linked in a suggestive way to what happened actually. But suggestive, they don't pronounce it. And and then you may finish. The first time that they really believed that it was the last picture is someone in Germany, in Germany in I think 1906. Yeah, 1906. That they say it must be his last picture, and something to do with the fact that they projected onto this picture and the other one, well, negative feelings, you could say, with crows into it. And from that time onwards, it was really the myth that it was his last picture. It was not something that came from the family, but from outside.
Yeah, in as early as 1890, when he was exhibited in Theo's apartment, so when Johan de Meester, the Dutch critic, came by, so he saw this painting, and he gave it first a title, which didn't have a title, of course, but we know it as Wheatfield with Crows, but he termed it as the Désolation des Champs, so the desolation of the fields. So already having this interpretation and knowing that it was within the range of the last paintings, I mean, so it was a couple of weeks before he ended his life. And suggestively said, well, could it be the last one? And then he was shown, in fact, that we found out later the last one. And he found it very weird because he found that the last one was, well, this reflected more the mood of the last painting than the one that was actually the last one. And that one is up as well, I believe, the tree roots. Yeah, this one. So we know for sure that this is his last painting, which he worked on the morning before he took his own life. And this painting, weirdly, for instance, was only exhibited the first time, when was it, in the 1950s? It's after the war. So it was never exhibited before the war.
I do not know exactly when, but it was certainly not exhibited
in the early period.
In the early period. But it was certainly known, at least by the family and by one critic, that it was his last picture. But he didn't believe it because he thought, well, it's full of sunshine and it's not negative at all, meaning there are no crows in it. And then it simply got lost. And it's only by accident, more or less, that we found out, or I did find out in a newspaper, that he had written it down. And then we started to investigate it. And then it turns out to be that this was his last picture. And another one related to it, which was the one before that.
This one,
both described by the brother of Jo van Gogh, so the wife of Theo, as being the last. This was his last sketch, and the other one was his last picture.
And there's another one, which was supposed to be the last picture. Yeah, this one, in Helsinki. And it was what last picture because it appears as if the sky was not finished. Because it's but it is in fact a very experimental picture by Vincent from over there. It's painted slightly early, we believe, because it's not what you see in the white. It's not the ground of the painting. It is a white coat of paint that he applied first, and then he added the bluish strokes on top of it. So it was a very experimental way of filling in a sky. So in you might say almost in a reversed way, is that the clouds are blue and the sky is white. So in a certain way.
You have to explain why we think pictures are the last ones, in the sense that they're not finished.
Yeah, exactly. So, and that's of course the idea that not finished. So the one before, the one from the Teio, which is in the gallery, is a beautiful picture, is indeed unfinished because you can tell from the sky. There you can see the bare canvas and the ground of the canvas, and these linear strokes of blue paint, which is the underdrawing of the painting itself. It's not really finished, and the tree roots as well is, although almost finished, you might say, but there are certain parts which where you indeed can see the bare canvas. Especially, can stand up a bit. Yeah, and the one slightly more to the right, this one. Yeah, that's just a bare canvas. And yeah, this one too. So what you would expect perhaps is that it would get a bit more lively, and especially in the under part, knowing Vincent's way of working. As usually, landscape pages usually start with the top and then work down the way to the bottom. So it's usually the bottom pages are not finished. The Teio gallery is an exception because the sky is not finished. So there you can say that not finished. So they have more claim to that being the last works, and Helsinki is a perfectly finished picture, although it's slightly more experimental than perhaps the other ones.
So was this the first painting ending up in a museum collection?
In Finland.
This is one of the first.
One of the first, yeah. 1903, I believe.
Yeah.
So that's
So very early on to enter a museum.
But of course, Irving Stone writing the novel Lust for Life, in the end, Van Gogh is indeed painting the feet of crowds, but it's not at the same time that he shoots himself. But that's a day later in the novel. But of course, in the film, you can't wait a day when you have this scene of pain. So there is this shot.
And speaking of his death, one of the more recently created myths surrounds his death. And could you address the speculation that Vincent died not by suicide, but by murder?
I don't believe they said it was murder, but accidentally shot by teenage boys, something like that. That's not true at all. I think we can be very clear on that. Van Gogh ended his own life. So it was suicide. It was something he said on his deathbed. It was also, how do you say, confirmed by people who were at the funeral, who heard the stories, etc. There's numerous sources. But, if you want to put a theory into the world, you read the sources differently, I guess. But yeah, it's for us, it's never been a question how he died, and that in itself is sad enough. So yeah.
Yeah. And also, especially also after his death, it's quite clear that everybody realized that, of course, nobody writes openly about suicide. Also afterwards, when somebody died, it's always very, very tragic. And especially in the 19th century, of course, it's not something you speak out openly. But very tellingly is, for instance, the letter that Emile Bernard, who was at the funeral on the 30th of July in 1890, and he wrote the next day a letter to Aurier, because who couldn't attend, and said that his great friend Vincent had died, and he didn't have to guess how. So it is, well, they may not have seen it coming, but nobody was really surprised that he took his own life. So, and we indeed believe that everything points to the fact, indeed, that he ended his own life, and up to the things that there is even something as not exactly what you might say a suicide note, but there is something he put in his pocket. It was found later by Theo, who wrote down on this piece of paper that it was found in his pockets. That terrible day, as Theo wrote on it. And first he wrote down the terrible day, 29th of July. That was, of course, when he found it and when Vincent died. And then he realized that Vincent had it in his pocket the day itself, and he crossed 29 out and he made it 27, because that's the day that he made the attempt, because he lived for another 30 hours.
Great answers are always surrounded by great myths. You tend to things, and once there is a myth, it will create other myths too. And I tend to think that the fact that he was shot by others is such a myth. I tend to think.
Johanna van Gogh-Bonger, Van Gogh's sister-in-law, played a significant role in distributing and popularizing Van Gogh's work in Europe and in the United States. Jo was also responsible for publishing the vast correspondence between Vincent and his brother Teio, and we've already mentioned it a couple of times. And she has recently received the deserved attention with a new biography that was issued in Dutch about 2 years ago, and very recently, 2 months ago, in English. Van Gogh Museum and Nienke, as one of the editors, is responsible for this magisterial edition of scholarly edition of Van Gogh letters that was published in a digital edition and in a book edition. So the question is whether what role Vincent correspondence played in interpretation of his art through the lens of biography.
Well, they were instrumental, these letters, and they were used very early on to explain his work. They were quotes from the letters were included in reviews, in exhibition catalogs, etc. Jo spent a lot of time making this edition, and she actually waited. It took her a long time because she was also translating them into English, and she had to, put an order in the letters because there was a lot of sheets often without envelopes, no dates. So it took her a long time to bring an order in that. But she also wanted to wait because she said the world needs to know his art and then learn about the man. First, they have to get acquainted with his work. But At the same time, some letters were already published. Before her edition was published in 1914, Émile Bernard had published the letters that Vincent had written to him in several installments in the magazine Mercure de France. So these letters were known, and they were also shared by Teio in the 6 months that he lived after Vincent, because of course also Teio died very tragically very soon. So all just to say that Teio already saw the importance of these letters. He shared them with critics who wanted to write about Vincent, like Aurier. And so they felt already at the time that they were beautifully written. They were explaining so well what he wanted to say with his art. And well, I think they played a big role in establishing his reputation, for sure. Yeah. It's a treasure trove. You should all read the letters, but also read this fantastic biography that our colleague wrote about Joe.
It's very unique, this kind of correspondence, because there are more artist correspondences, of course, and but none as interesting as this one, because he, as you earlier explained, is that he wrote, of course, when he received some money, he had to write back that he had received it. At the same time, he wrote what he did with it, paint, and his ideas. So normally, I know from other artist correspondence that I've consulted for other research questions, is that you have stacks of letters and it's just by fun. Are you at home tomorrow morning? Then I will come by, and it's just these short notices of things like that. No, not as much about what you're actually doing. It's something that you did tell somebody, or but not write about immediately. So
and also because often it was his way of sharing his thoughts when he didn't have someone he was close with. He would just pour his thoughts onto the paper.
That's why, in a certain sense, it is a bit of a shame that in the Paris period, so in 86 and 87, when he went to Paris and he lived with his brother, there was, of course, no need of writing. And in that period, of course, his complete art changed. He discovered the Impressionists, the Neo-Impressionists, and from this dark artist, he discovered color and color theory and everything. But we have no written facts about it because they lived together. There was no reason to write. So that's a bit of a shame, but for the rest, it's perfect for scholars.
You could say that Van Gogh published his own biography by writing those letters, and that's probably how it worked from the beginning. Émile Bernard indeed suggested very early on to publish them, and he did so because he thought that the first criticism about Van Gogh was not too hopeful, not good enough. He believed that there was no really signs that they would going to appreciate that man, and then he thought, well, we have to put in the life, because the life will certainly interest the people in a broader way. I'm not totally sure whether that worked directly, because it did take some time for everything was being published, but certainly in the end it did, and it works as a kind of biography. And the problem is, of course, that now all art historians are reading to a certain extent his paintings as a kind of biography, and the problem is, of course, that they are linked to his life, but they are not his biography, nor his letters are a kind of biography.
No, and they were not a diary either, the letters.
No.
There was always somebody receiving the letter, so you would put things in the letter for that specific person. It's never, he was always aware of, and also of other people reading them, because when he's writing to Émile Bernard, he knows that when Bernard is working with Gauguin, he will have him read the letter as well. So it is personal, but there's always a strategy behind it. I mean, it's showing, look how I'm working, I need more money or whatever. It's not a diary. It's important to realize that.
But also not a manual to his paintings.
No.
Although he talks a lot about painting and he gives you a lot of information, the problem is, of course, that he also had a tragedy and had to, well, first of all, get money from his brother, and preferably more than his brother was offering him. And secondly, he didn't always know what he was doing, you tend to think, because you have to keep in mind he was alone there. And if there's not an artist who is looking over your own shoulder and say, hey, this is good what you are doing, you don't know what you're doing and you don't know the value of it. So not everything what he thought or believed or was hesitating about is in those letters.
Yeah, you can see it a little bit, for instance, in the Dutch letters, when when he was also corresponding with a colleague artist, Anton van Rappard. And when you compare them with the letters he wrote to Theo at the same time, you can see the differences. So with Van Rappard, he goes into discussions more about art and what you're doing and what you're working on. With Theo, it's slightly more on the sunny side sometimes, in the sense that it's different. So you have to be aware of that, of course, when with the correspondence like that, and what he's not telling.
And to his sister Wilhelmine, he was much more educational in the sense that he had to explain to her what he was doing because he didn't not know so much about art. So, so these letters are most of the time quite revealing because he tells something which he didn't tell to Theo because, of course, he suspected that that was usual for him to know.
Well, we have many more questions, but I do wonder if we should open it up to the audience in the room. And we also have, of course, our live stream. I don't know if you're having questions come in.
We have already answered a couple of questions that appeared in the online comments.
Are there any questions in the room? I'm happy to bring the mic over.
Thank you very much. And I would like to ask if there was any relation or any letters or correspondence questioning about Cézanne.
For Gogh writing on Cézanne,
Yes?
not very much. We know that he saw Cézanne in the Paris period, for instance, where we don't have any letters. But that's the first time that we really saw Cézanne in the shop of Tanguy. Where he would buy his paint supplies, and where Cézanne would have bought him. He was working in the south of France, but he was aware of Cézanne.
But
And
was he ever in the south of France at the same time as Cézanne?
It was at the same time, and he was very much aware. And the funny thing is that Cézanne was a painter of the south. He came from Aix-en-Provence. He came from the south. Cézanne went to the south and wanted to be a painter of the south as well. But of course, he realized he wasn't born there, and you can only be part of it when you also come from that part. But he was. Cézanne was working in Aix-en-Provence, Vincent in Arles. There is about 70 kilometers in between, and they're on either side of a stretch which is called La Crau. And he said, well, he was thinking that he is working on this side of La Crau, that's his part. Now on the other side is his other master, is Cézanne working. So he was very much aware of it, and he saw in the shop of Tanguy, he saw the harvest by Cézanne, in the shop where we refer to when he made his own harvest. Very differently, so there was no influence in the sense of, you might say, painterly, but very much in the sense artistically that there was another great painter working on the other side of La Crau.
Thank you.
There is a question from the online viewer about the self-harm incident. Did he really gifted his ear to a prostitute?
Yes, he did. Yeah. We don't know why.
We know that it was kept in a jar for a long time in the hospital, and at a certain time, probably when somebody cleaned it.
And there is a drawing made by a physician
Yes,
who treated
that's right.
him immediately after the incident.
Yeah, he had the ear, so even perhaps possibility of sewing it back on, but it was too late for that.
I was wondering if there were any indications in any of the letters that he might take his life, and also, was he ever photographed?
There's one photograph of him, a portrait photograph, when he was about 19 years old. So he doesn't look then like, well, basically the image that we have of Van Gogh is his self-portraits. There's no photos of him at that time, so not at when he was an adult. There's one photo when he's seen from the back, but that's it. So
he didn't like to be photographed, as we found out. Is that so? He didn't photograph. The reason, for instance, started portrait painting is because photographs made someone dead, in a sense. In the black and white photographs and the portrait, there was no life in it. So, for instance, when he was sent a photograph of his mother in the south of France, a recently taken photograph just around her birthday, what he did was make a painting of it. use it for a painting to create some life in the black and white. And he was not as very keen on photography. That's in the sense symbolic indeed with the photograph that there is from in Paris, where he's sitting along the Seine in Agnières together with Bernard. You look Bernard in the face and you see Vincent on the back. It's almost like a demonstration of I don't want to be photographed.
And your other question about if he ever talks about suicide in his letters, there are some mentions previously when he says something like to his brother, if I wouldn't have you, I would already have gone in that direction.
That's before he decides to go to the asylum.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's
Yeah.
after he comes, yeah.
Yeah. So there are some indications that he was considering
As a possibility.
as a possibility, but it's very much between the lines. Yeah.
Another question from our online audience. Does anyone believe the lead in the paints to have anything to do with his illness?
No. Well, lead, of course, it is a common, especially if old art, lead white. It's very toxic, of course, and that's the idea also that he was eating his paint, for instance.
Right,
So he-
right. Yellow
But-
paint, that's the...
Yeah, yellow gold is especially lead white. Lead white will, I mean, even when you take the cadmium colors or the chrome colors, and especially vermilion, it's only highly toxic, and emerald is very toxic. They're all now differently made than they were in the 19th century. So, but he didn't live long enough probably to really suffer from that, because it's only 10 years that he worked, of course. And it's one of these things, as explained before, about the many illnesses that he had. So this is something else. It's all these things. Did he eat his paint? This is the paint toxic. Also, the halo shapes in his paintings has to do with some kind of a disease in the eyes. Everybody also wants to explain it in a way that it's a medical thing, or in a way because as if somebody could not make these paintings having his full understanding and his full reason, in a sense. But he had his full reason in that sense. And it's not.
But if it was that, then all painters at that time
Yeah,
would have had
everybody,
this intoxication.
Yeah.
I mean, they were all using the same paint. So, and yeah, there are a few instances in the asylum when his doctor later on said we had to take his painting materials away because he was trying to eat the paint to basically poison himself. But this was
He didn't do that.
no, he
Only
didn't do
during
that
a
every
crisis.
day.
No. And of course, and it's you see with painters who grow very old, they sometimes indeed get these problems of to do with lead poisoning and or other kind of poisoning, or the differences with looking quite clearly like Monet and Renoir. And but Vincent never lived to that age.
The absinthe was more toxic.
The absinthe was
probably.
more toxic.
Are there any other questions here in the audience?
This is perhaps more about a theory than a myth. Is there some question about his ability to perceive color, that he was perhaps a form of color blindness, that he used therefore stronger strokes and more intense use to compensate for a color issue?
No, it's not to do with color blind. In fact, he had an incredible keen sense of color. So, if, for instance, that he may not have been a very natural talent for drawing, something he had to learn, and in the end he got very good at it. He had more of a talent for color, and he was even when he was working in the Netherlands, when his dark, subdued colors, he knew exactly how to create these dark colors. So never with black, but always with other colors, and create certain hues. So it was very, very good sense sight, you might see, of colors. In the end, when he discovered the pure colors and painting with pure colors, he really pushed it to the limit, and deliberately, in a sense, to make these beautiful, very colorful paintings. But there's something else attached to it as well. It was very well known also at the time by many painters, especially Impressionists, that a lot of these colors were new. I mean, the tube paint was quite new in the second half of the 19th century. And there were all kinds of recipes, and a lot of these paints were very unstable and very vulnerable to light, and would change over time during, or fade even, during the course of light on it. And they realized that. So Vincent wrote in a beautiful letter to Bernard, is that these colors that we use nowadays are horrible, in fact, but and they give in, they fade over time, like flowers. So all the more reason to put them on more brightly, because then taking more into consideration that they would tone down perhaps a little bit over time. The weird thing is that some colors simply disappear. I think he wouldn't have liked that it would disappear. One of the most stunning colors is the color purple. Purple was a favorite color of many Impressionists. Now, it's not immediately the color that you associate so much with Impressionist painting. It's more blue, these beautiful, stark blues. But a lot of painters, and Vincent was one of them, made his own purples by mixing a blue with a red. And for these reds, he used very vulnerable and fugitive pigments, red lakes. And they disappear over time. So in the end, you have a beautiful purple color. In a couple of years, it's blue. And it simply disappears. And just to give you one example for your imagination, we all know iconic painting of his bedroom, for instance. We have one version in our museum. There's one from the Chicago Museum. There's one in Paris. The beautiful blue walls you see on that painting and the doors were originally purple and lilac. And we made a reconstruction in our museum where you can, on an iPad, you can change it, you might say. And the first time you do it, you go like that. Sometimes we even believe it's not so bad that they faded to blue, perhaps. But it gives you an idea. And it's interesting from our scientific point of view is that how did the original paintings of Van Gogh look like when he painted them? Because they were even more colorful than they are today.
Yeah, and he's been called the painter indeed of blue and yellow in the 20th century. But this is all in contrast with what Gauguin said of him, namely that he was the painter of yellow and violet. So
yeah, violet. Yeah.
And that was the contrast, of course.
Yeah.
The yellow was opposed to violet or purple on the color wheel, and was the strongest contrast that you could get.
So when you, for instance, when you see a Van Gogh painting, you see blue, and you see orange next to it, then you know that it's blue, originally blue. When you see a yellow next to it, the blue, it could have been purple. Because opposite colors is orange and blue. It's like it's red and green, orange and blue, purple and violet, purple and yellow.
And you would also tend to think that if he had a kind of disease, that all his pictures would look the same. Yeah. And the problem is that they don't look the same. There's so much different. There's so much variety in his oeuvre, especially from, the beginning, from the moment that he arrives in Arles and stays in France. It's different.
A question from an online audience member. Have the backs of the paintings been examined, and has anything of note been discovered? Maybe one example.
That's a nice question.
Exciting discovery.
Yes, well, we try to always examine the backs of paintings, and actually we sometimes, when they are not lined, I must say, because often there's an extra or a second canvas attached to the canvas to give it support. This was something rather a general thing to do, which is a shame because it hides the original canvas, the back of the canvas. But we have found numbers, for example.
Numbers,
maybe you want to explain a little bit.
The numbers is nice because when Van Gogh died, and so the whole collection came into the hands of Johanna van Gogh-Bomme, so Theo's wife, the widow, and she would send these pictures to exhibitions. And already in 1819, her brother Andries made a list of all the works in the apartment in Paris. So it's a list for well over 400 paintings with a title, usually the format, so it's the standard format, so they have numbers behind it, and as well and a number. And we refer to this. In fact, it's the first catalog of the collection of Johanna, and these numbers were used for exhibitions. So she would send number 160, 170, 165 to a certain exhibition, and for the exhibition, they would receive in charcoal or whatever on the back large number 165, and then sometimes these titles can be like you have an orchard, but there are 5 orchards. You walk orchard, 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 orchard. So it's very difficult. So which one was at what exhibition? And it has a number, so you can get it back. And one of the wonderful things with these numbers was when we made the discovery of a new Van Gogh painting in 2013. We published this Sunset at Montmajour, a beautiful arrow painting from the summer of 1888. And it was actually in the letters and everything. We could track it down, and it was sent to Theo. And then we realized, well, if it was sent to Theo, and it was in an estate afterwards, and it went perhaps to an exhibition, is there a number on the back? And is there, can we get to the Bonger inventory, are there any numbers, whatever associated with it? And almost all the numbers we can associate with a certain picture. So, but there are still a couple of numbers that we're unknown which painting belongs to that number. And then we asked our conservator, is there a number on the back? We hadn't even thought about this. And oh yeah, there's a big number, 180. And then we found that this was one of the numbers that we didn't know what it was. And so we could trace it back. It was called Sunset and Montmajour, and the size 30 and 180, and indeed it was on the back of the painting. So there was an extra reference. But this is the painting that was actually in the collection of Jo and everything. And then we could trace it back. And then we saw it on 2 exhibitions in the 1890s in the Netherlands. And then around 1901, it disappeared from the collection and was sold. And then it came into a Norwegian collection around 1908. And there it disappeared into an attic only to resurface in around 2010. So it was quite an incredible discovery. But then the number, indeed, it helps sometimes with the information on the back, stamps sometimes on the stretchers, labels of art galleries, exhibitions and everything. Yeah, absolutely.
And there was this nice discovery recently by the National Galleries of Scotland in Edinburgh, who found a painting on the back of one of their paintings, which was actually a self-portrait. Yeah. And because it was hidden by what was it, a panel?
Yeah, it was a panel glued
so
to
it's
the back
cardboard
of the painting.
Painted on both sides, and then it was attached to, at some point early on, to a panel. So actually they took it off, and or they're going to take it off.
They're going to take it off.
No. So sometimes there's
there's another painting on the other side,
or underneath, or on the other side. Yeah.
Nevertheless, this is all scholarly stuff. If you want to enjoy Van Gogh, please look at the front.
Well, I want to thank the panelists. I mean, this is wonderful. It's just amazing to hear your insights.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for this great show.
Yeah.
Well, and thanks for those of you who came in person. Thanks to those of you who tuned in, hopefully from around the world. Come see the exhibition if you can. It closes January 22nd. So thank you. Good night.